I read the entire 108-page NAR settlement agreement, proposed settlement agreement, so you don't have to. So I'm going to take the opportunity to break it down for you so that you know what actually changed and what didn't. So first things first, who was released? And that will include, and pardon me, I am going to be referring to my notes because, like I said, this thing is 108 pages. So who is released? NAR and its members, realtor MLSs, non-realtor MLSs, real estate brokerages with 2022 transaction volume of less than $2 billion. And this is not no strings attached. It's not just because you fall into one of those categories. You have to fall into one of those categories, and you have to abide by the terms of the settlement agreement, which includes some compliance, cooperation, and in some cases, payment. Next thing, let's talk about the total amount of the settlement. Total amount of the settlement is $418 million, which sounds quite a bit better than the maybe not quite $8 billion. I think it rounds to $1.8 billion jury verdict. Another thing I want to say is, yes, the settlement agreement has been entered into between the parties, but because there's ongoing litigation and there's a lot of people involved, yes, a court does have to approve this. So this thing isn't done yet. It is highly, highly likely to be approved as written. Most of the commentary and the smart people that have looked at this don't really see a lot of opportunities for this to be changed materially. So we're looking at a very high percentage that the document that we have been provided and that we have seen, even though it hasn't been submitted to the court, will be the final document. Now, the main thing that you guys are going to care about are these practice changes. And I know I keep doing air quotes, but because when I tell them to you, you're going to be shaking your head and probably, remember, I'm just a messenger. I'm not saying that this is what you do. In fact, I know this is not what most of you do. So the practice changes include that NAR will eliminate or prohibit any requirement that listing brokers or sellers must make offers of compensation to buyer brokers. That, like I said, that is already not a requirement. There is no requirement that sellers must pay the buyer's agent. That is one of the biggest things I think that the headlines are getting wrong, and probably the biggest things that most real estate agents are frustrated by is that, the headlines are saying, oh, NAR has agreed to get rid of the 6% commissions. Well, that is not a requirement anyway. While it may be customary in some areas it's certainly not. It's not a requirement. There's not been anything, there's no written stated you must pay 6% and you must give half of it to the buyer's agent. Now, I'm not suggesting that there may not be some people in the U.S. that didn't abide by the already existing rules and they've said that it's a requirement, but it isn't. But remember, this is really the part where it comes in that this language is colored strongly by the allegations made by the plaintiffs. So the plaintiffs were saying, well, it was required of us. These are sellers that are saying it was required of us to pay the buyer's agent. Part of that is lack of education. They didn't know. Another thing, eliminate and prohibit any requirement that any offer of compensation to buyer reps must be blanket, unconditional, or unilateral. Again, that is, to my knowledge, not a requirement anyway. And in fact, I think, especially in North Carolina, brokerages around here are very careful to say, you can decide what you want to do. You can ask us for input about what may be common in the area, but it is up to you, seller, what you're going to do. Now, some of the commentary about this particular practice change is that this may open up a window for some sellers to be discriminatory. So where they'll say, I will offer buyer agent compensation, but only to agents of a certain gender, race, age. We hope that doesn't happen, but this particular wording of the language has people questioning, oh my goodness, will this mean that sellers can be discriminatory? And no, they are not allowed to be discriminatory, but it may open up windows for them to covertly be discriminatory. Next thing, and this is probably what everybody is abuzz about, is that offers of compensation to the buyer's broker cannot be made via the MLS or disclosing on the MLS total broker compensation. So basically combined compensation to both listing and cooperating brokers. This is the change. So right now you're allowed to state that on MLS, not anymore. Now, it's very important to notice that it doesn't say prohibit making offers of compensation. It is that you cannot do it using the MLS. You cannot make those offers of compensation to a buyer agent on the MLS. You can use off MLS means of doing that. Next, require realtor MLSs to eliminate all broker compensation fields on the MLS, and then prohibit the sharing of offers of compensation using any other MLS field. So this is really just pushing the fact that not only are you not supposed to use the MLS anymore to make those offers, that the MLSs are supposed to make it nearly impossible for you to try. So there's not going to be a dedicated field to, buyer agent compensation. There in your MLS, maybe there isn't one already, but if there is, it has to be removed. And then also clamping down, making sure that other fields are not being used to share that. So you can't come up with code words and try to stick it in the property description to let buyers agents know that the seller is offering compensation. Really, the other things here, a big one is agreeing not to create some other website to facilitate the offers of compensation. And this is specifically to NAR and the MLSs. So they can't promulgate and create these other websites to say, hey, for this property, this is what we're offering. But that doesn't prevent these types of websites from being made. They just can't be made by the MLS. They can't be encouraged by the MLS or NAR. They can't use the data that they have to create some other website to share this information in order to circumvent the requirements that are imposed on them by this settlement agreement. And then the next thing that is, again, not truly a change, but is becoming more firm. It is already strongly encouraged and in some instances required by your local association of realtors that you have to have your buyer agency agreement signed before you make any tours of the property. That is now, it's just a requirement now. And that is maybe making some agents nervous of, buyers are not patient in a lot of cases. They see a house and they text you and they say, can we see it in 30 minutes? Well, maybe, but now you're going to have to make sure that your buyer agency agreement is signed before you ever get into that property. And in that buyer agency agreement, already in your existing buyer agency agreement, at least in North Carolina, you're already disclosing what your compensation will be and how it will be determined. The settlement is very careful to call out that your language describing your compensation can't be open-ended. You have to have a way of determining what the amount will be from that document. So the example that they give in the settlement agreement is you can't write, buyer broker compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering to the buyer. That's not ascertainable. So you have to be able to say buyer agent compensation is 2.5% of the purchase price or whatever it is that you agree upon. If it's a flat rate, buyer agent shall be paid $8,000 for these services. That is, again, negotiable between you and the buyer, but it has to be, you have to use language that you can end up with a number from reading that document. And then also, this says that the agent, the realtor, cannot receive compensation out in excess of what is agreed to in that buyer agency agreement. So in North Carolina, there have been versions of the buyer agency agreement that would allow a buyer agent, say they agreed to 2.5% with the buyer, but the seller was offering 3%, would allow them to capture that extra 0.5%. This language pretty explicitly says that's not possible anymore. Next, the realtors and MLS participants cannot represent that a buyer's brokerage, or really any brokerage services, are free or available at no cost unless they are actually not being paid to do the work. So it has, I've heard this myself in our market where it's, gosh, my law partner even used to say this, is I don't understand why a buyer wouldn't get an agent. It doesn't cost them anything. And agents can't say that anymore. You can't say that buyers, it's no cost to the buyer unless you will not be making any money from your services. All right, also that you have to, if you're acting for a seller, you have to conspicuously disclose and obtain a seller approval to make any offers of compensation to the buyer. Again, not a change. You can't, make an offer to a buyer's agent to pay their compensation with the seller's money if you haven't gotten their approval to do that. So this is kind of a duh. Next, that realtors and MLS participants must disclose to sellers and buyers in conspicuous language that commissions are not set by law and fully negotiable. This is another one that is probably having you roll your eyes, especially if you're in one of those markets or you're participating in a local association, that those forms already say that. That part of the allegations in this lawsuit is that even if that commissions aren't standard and that they are negotiable, that these plaintiffs didn't know that, or they were told that wasn't the case. So this is really kind of a prime example of why education is extremely important whenever you are taking on a seller or buyer client. And this has now just become part of the requirements that, even if you don't find yourself being the best at explaining or educating on this topic, you will unfortunately have to get good at it very quickly. And there's some repeated information about making sure that it is not possible to filter out listings based on offers of compensation to buyers. So they're, making it, like I said, nearly impossible, difficult or nearly impossible for an agent to be able to sort properties by sellers that are offering buyer agent commission. Now, moving on from the practice changes. Oh, not yet. A big thing is that these practice changes, all the obligations set forth in that paragraph 58, which is really the biggest paragraph in this document, these things are going to terminate 7 years after the class notice date. Okay, so 7 years from whenever that, probably sometime in 2024, 7 years after that class notice date is when this will end. Now, these practice changes have to go into effect, it says as soon as practicable, but not later than the date of the class notice. So some of you may have been hearing this July 15th date thrown around, and that is kind of saying, that's kind of based off of if this settlement had been filed for approval already, and there had already been that motion made, I guess this came out on the 15th, then it would have fallen right around the 15th. NAR, I don't believe they've said anything saying it was July 15th. Their communications have been mid-July, and that's kind of based off of, okay, assuming that the motion to approve the settlement gets filed pretty promptly, then the class notice date is going to fall sometime in mid-July. So that's the drop dead date for these practice changes to go into effect. So I would not be reliant on any July 15th date. I don't believe that's accurate based on the wording of the settlement, but I believe that NAR, once the motion to approve the settlement has been filed, will be giving communication with specific dates of when the practice changes will go into effect. Now, the cooperation section, which comes next, this is where the NAR is agreeing to provide valuable cooperation to the plaintiffs and the class members in other actions for providing documents and authenticating them, providing people to testify at depositions and in live testimony at trial. Really, essentially, this is like participating and helping them in their discovery process and being witnesses for them. So really, that is the meat of the settlement agreement. And yeah, I went into all the details of what it says and what it does not say. And I really think that what you're going to find is not that much changed. Most of this stuff is stuff that you already have to do or are already not allowed to do. So this is, I guess if there's any good out of that, is that there are going to be more educational materials put out that will help buyers and sellers understand how commissions work. We are lucky in our state to have a lot of agents that do this already. So from our perspective as a real estate attorney in Lake Norman, not a whole lot's going to change for our agents. I do think there are going to be challenges for especially buyers agents going forward, having to get in these buyer agency agreements for a certain compensation and then finding out that the seller's not willing to offer the buyer's agent compensation, and then buyer having to bring those funds to closing. I think the lack of awareness of what's really going on with the settlement may have a lot of buyers scared to engage buyer's agents. And this is really the time to clarify the value that an agent adds to the transaction. I will speak from a closing attorney's perspective in that when we have good agents representing buyers and sellers, the transactions go way better. Just like any profession, I've said this in other videos, there are people that are good at it and people that are bad at it. If we have a bad agent on a transaction, no, it doesn't go better. But there are many more good agents than there are bad agents, and I would rather have a good agent involved in the transaction, because when there are not agents involved in the transaction, they go off the rails, and the parties, are listening to people that don't have any knowledge or education about the process. They're listening to their Uncle Jim, who last bought a house in '79. And that doesn't mean those people aren't full of wisdom, but they're not up to date on what's going on now. They may not know the vendors. They may not have all of the current training that agents are required to keep up with to keep their licenses. So what I mostly fear is if buyers are not educated about the value that agents add to the transaction, that they may be reluctant to bring an agent into the transaction. So this is going to require a lot of innovation and education on the part of real estate agents. We are really looking forward to our North Carolina Association of Realtors providing some guidance going forward about what is going to be required of agents, and just suggestions for how to navigate the changes here and the new landscape, and hopefully providing more education that will be consumer facing. The intent of class actions is usually to protect consumers, and while I understand the intent behind the settlement, what I fear the most is that there may end up being a lot of buyer consumers harmed in the process because they won't have adequate representation throughout the transaction. So this is the time where we all get creative and put on our innovation hats, and we're going to figure out a way through this, just like realtors have been doing for 100 years. So hopefully this was helpful to explain the settlement. Like I said, less changed than stayed the same, but the things that changed are big changes that are actually going to affect how we do our day-to-day work. So if you have any questions about that, leave them in the comments. We can do follow-up videos, but hopefully this helped you understand the settlement a little bit better.